All right, hello everybody. So welcome to Life Science Live. My name's Bree, and today we're going to be talking about some Christmas plants. So I've got them all stacked up behind the camera, so I'm gonna have to come back here every so often to grab some different ones. But I wanted to start off by talking about Christmas trees. And so at this time of year, a lot of us are going out finding a Christmas tree for our house. And sometimes when we're driving down the street, we might see some big tall evergreen trees, and it's hard to know what counts as a Christmas tree and maybe what counts as a pine tree or what counts as an evergreen tree or a conifer. We hear all these different words and it's hard to know which is which and what these mean. So we're going to try to tell you some of the differences between them and what they are. And to start off explaining things, we're going to get this little guy right here. So this is a branch from a blue spruce. And a blue spruce is a pretty common Christmas tree. Some people don't like it because it's pokey. And if I hold it up close here, you might be able to see those little points on the ends of the branches. But it's really nice because it has these lots of thick needles. It usually makes a pretty nice Christmas tree shape. We have a picture here of that Christmas tree shape that you often see. And then here is a picture of the cone that a spruce makes. And I actually was able to find a real spruce cone. So if you look at the cone here, you can see it's a little bit different from a pine cone. And that's because a spruce tree, while it is an evergreen tree, it'll stay green all year round. It's a conifer because it makes cones. It's not a pine. And we'll show you what a pine looks like here in a little bit. But a spruce tree is in a group of its own. And they make these sort of papery cones. The scales are thinner and they're stiff, but they're not hard like a pine cone. And then to tell it apart from some other spruce trees, you can see that raggedy look that the blue spruce cone has. It's not quite as smooth as some of the other spruce trees. So, blue spruces, they have these pointy needles like I mentioned. They grow in the western United States, actually kind of the southwestern portion. They grow here in Utah. You can find them in Colorado, and then down into Arizona and New Mexico. And they look slightly different from a similar tree. I'll show you a picture right here. Another common Christmas tree is the Douglas fir. So the interesting thing about a Douglas fir is that it's not actually a fir tree, not a true fir tree. So over here, I have a really big branch from what I believe is a white fir. And this is a true fir. If you look at this picture here of a Douglas fir branch, you can see that the needles kind of go off to the sides. It looks very flat. A true fir tree, the needles would wrap all the way around the branch. You can see they are sort of whirled around there. They're not quite as flat as a Douglas fir. And the sad thing is I was going to bring a Douglas fir branch today because at home my Christmas tree is a Douglas fir. We actually cut it down here over in the Manti La Sal National Forest, so just a couple hours away from Provo. And they grow all throughout Utah and the western US. The white fir doesn't grow here in Utah, but you can find those Douglas firs here. Let's see. Look at our next tree over here. Oops. All right, so we've talked about spruces and firs. The next one we're going to talk about is pine trees. So these here are pictures of the ponderosa pine. It's a huge pine tree. It can grow over 250 feet tall, and it lives out here in the western United States. And so back here I have a branch from a ponderosa pine. And so if you look at this, you can see these needles are a lot longer than anything that you'll find on a fir tree or a spruce tree. These needles are pretty short. They tend to grow all around the branch, and they'll grow as just one needle at a time. They come off in a in a single needle growing right off the stem. And the same with the fir over here. The pine tree, a true pine tree, will have needles that grow in fascicles. And a fascicle is a fun little word for this piece of tissue that you can see here at the base of the needles. Try to get it to focus on this instead of me. And if you look at a fascicle, you'll find that it often has more than one needle growing in it. Most pine trees have several needles clumped up in a little fascicle, and then those are attached to the branches of the pine tree. So these guys, pine trees, they don't really make good Christmas trees. Most of them have pretty long needles. You don't want to hang your ornament on a needle because it's just going to fall off. And that's why we usually use spruce trees and fir trees. So going back to the spruces and the firs real quick, the fir tree that I had tends to be more popular because it's not quite as pokey as those spruce trees. Spruce needles. Oh, thanks for the tip. I'll see if I can get that to work with my needles here. Might be helping just a little bit so you can kind of see the shape of those needles. The spruce needles are square shaped. And I said that really briefly earlier, but try to get him focused here. When I turn him around, you can almost see, not quite. He has little corners that go all the way around there. So when I roll him between my fingers, I can feel each of those corners and he rolls really easily. If I was to try to do that with one of these fir needles, I'll pick one off right here, you'll see the shape of this one is a bit more flat. The white fir is not quite as flat as a Douglas fir, but when I try to roll him between my fingers, it's a little bit harder. He kind of just pops over, and it's not as smooth and easy as rolling a spruce needle between your fingers. So if you're ever out trying to tell the difference, that's one good way to do it. It's in the office. Oh wait, it's in the classroom, Lindsay. In the classroom. Sorry about that. All right, and then a pine needle. Last of all, they're really long, and they tend to have sort of a flat surface on top and a curved surface underneath. I'll try to get him to focus again. And these ones, you can see they're a little tiny bit twisted as it goes around. And they're often a lot longer than just these short little spruce and pine needles. So, those are ones that people tend to think of as Christmas trees. One that you might not have heard of, spruce, fir, and pine are all pretty familiar words, but a pretty unique and interesting one is a cedar tree. So this one here comes from an Atlas cedar. And if you look at the arrangement of these needles, you'll see that they're growing on these little bunches all along the stem. It's pretty easy to confuse the individual needles with a spruce needle because they kind of have that square shape that rolls between your fingers. But where the cedar tree grows in these bunches, you'll remember the spruce tree. Their needles grow all the way around in these little singly branched needles. But unlike a pine tree, we've got a leaf from a different tree stuck in here. Unlike a pine tree, the cedar needles aren't bunched into fascicles. They just grow off these short little stems in little bunches. Eventually I'll get it to focus the way I want it to. Here we go. So the Atlas cedar is actually a really cool tree. It doesn't come from here in the US. This one was growing on campus. They planted it out on BYU campus. But they come from Morocco. And out in Morocco, they're an endangered tree because they make really good wood and people have chopped a lot of them down and overexploited the trees so that there aren't quite as many as there used to be. And so they're working on preserving those Atlas cedars, but they're a really beautiful tree. Let me show you a picture of the entire thing here. They don't get nearly as tall as like our ponderosa pine. They only grow to be about 120 feet or so at their tallest, but they do often have this really pretty blue color. And people like to plant them here as trees in gardens and yards. And the same with a lot of the other trees that we've talked about. They make good ornamental trees. The cones on a cedar tree are behind my camera over here. So this right here is a female cone. And you'll see that they make this really tight shape. This cone has actually, since it's fallen off the tree, it started to open up a little bit. But while they're sitting on the tree, you'll often see them in this shape here. They're really tight, really smooth. They don't have those super obvious scales sticking off like some of the other conifers do. And they sit up on top of the branches, standing up, whereas a pine tree or a spruce tree, their needle or their cones will often hang down. So this one was from our spruce. This one over here is from a ponderosa pine, and so they'll hang from those branches, and the seeds will grow down in the gaps between these scales. All the conifers, or most of the conifers, also have different cones for male and female cones. So I mentioned that this was a female cone from our cedar. This one is a female cone from a pine tree. Those are the ones that make the seeds. But conifers also need cones to make the pollen. So this right here is a male cone from an Atlas cedar. And if it wasn't all wet from the snow the past couple days, I would probably be able to squeeze it and pollen would just poof out. As it moves these cones around, it'll blow their pollen, and that pollen will make contact with the female cone, and then it allows the seeds to start developing. All right, so most of those trees that we just talked about, actually all those trees that we just talked about, were in the pine family. So they're closely related to pines, even though not all of them are pines. But this next one that we're going to talk about, over back here, is in the cypress family. So this is a branch from a juniper tree. And if you see a juniper tree growing out, you'll probably immediately think of a Christmas tree. They make this really nice conical shape that we like to have in our Christmas trees. A lot of people have them growing out in their gardens and yards because you can have cultivars that make super nice shapes. And even in the wild here in Utah, young juniper trees will grow and make a really nice Christmas tree shape out in the wild. Then as they get older, oftentimes they'll sort of spread out and look a little bit more flat and uneven. One thing that makes them different from all those trees that we looked at in the pine family is that instead of having those long or just individual needles like a pine tree, they have scales on their leaves. So we'll try to get it to where you can see sort of that shape of these scaly looking leaves. But they are still evergreen, and they are still conifers. A juniper cone, though, is different from one of the pine family cones because they actually look like little berries. So here's a picture of some juniper berries. You've probably seen them before, these sort of grayish blue berries that will grow on a juniper. And even though they look like berries, they are modified cones. So over time, instead of having scales on their cones like other conifer trees, their scales have developed into more of a fleshy shell around the outside of a seed. And some kinds of junipers will have just one seed that grows inside their cone. Other kinds will have a couple of seeds that grow inside one cone, but it's still a cone even though it looks like a berry. You can also get some different shapes like these flat junipers that grow out as ground cover. A lot of people like to use those in their gardens. There are lots and lots of different kinds of junipers. This next one is another unique kind of conifer called a yew. And these are pretty common to talk about at Christmas time. They have this really pretty green and red coloration. So you can see here, this little guy growing down there. Just like the juniper, this is a cone. It's not actually a real berry. And the red part of this yew cone is actually edible, but you should never ever eat the edible part because everything else on a yew tree is not edible. It's poisonous and it can kill you. So the leaves, the stems, the roots, everything about it is highly poisonous. But that red part sometimes will get eaten. It's just very difficult to get away from the seed in the middle. So if you look, try to get it to focus again. You can see that dark thing down there on the inside is the seed that will grow inside that cone. All right, so those are all the conifers that I had for you today. If you have any questions about conifers, you can go ahead and send them in the chat. And then we're going to move on and talk really quick about some other Christmas plants. So this first one that I have right here, I wish that I'd been able to find an actual plant, but it doesn't really grow here in Utah, is mistletoe. And this is a leafy mistletoe. There is a type of mistletoe that grows here called dwarf mistletoe. It doesn't quite have the leaves like this one, but it is related to mistletoe, and both of them are parasites. So you can see it in this picture here and in this picture over here. They're growing on the branches of trees. So mistletoe will grow up in a tree canopy, and as the leaves of the tree fall off in the winter, you'll often see left behind those bright green balls, and that's the mistletoe. They stick their roots kind of down into the plant, and they'll get nutrients and water from the plant, which is not very good for the plant. Usually if there's just a little bit of mistletoe growing on there, it's not bad, but if mistletoe starts to build up in a tree, it can be pretty detrimental to the tree. The mistletoe reproduces by making these pretty little white berries, and that's kind of what you'll see if you have real mistletoe as a Christmas decoration, maybe hanging from your ceiling. They have these bright green leaves that stay green all year, and usually white berries. So it's not really super known how mistletoe became connected with Christmas. Mistletoe has been a symbol of fertility for a really long time, and so people would hang it up and you'd kiss under the mistletoe just like we still do today. And then about in the 1800s it started becoming associated with Christmas time, and it's stuck around until today. All right, and then our last Christmas plant that I have for you guys is the holly. And I was sad that I couldn't, oh wait, we have one more after this. Our second to last Christmas plant. I couldn't find any of this one either because it also doesn't really grow as much out here in Utah. People don't use it as much as they do maybe back east. But they have these beautiful bright green leaves and red berries. And these are an evergreen plant, which means they stay green all year, but it's not a conifer. So these berries are not modified cones like the juniper berry or the yew berry. They're actual berries. And they're very prickly. I used to have some holly bushes growing over on the side of my house in Texas, and my cat liked to get caught under them, and you'd have to crawl through the prickly bushes to get him out. Not very fun, but it's a good protection from anything that might be trying to eat those holly leaves. All right, now the actual last plant that I have is a poinsettia. So these are pretty popular as Christmas plants. They come from Mexico. So you can see they're bright colors. They like to live in more humid places usually. And the reason they're associated with Christmas is because they often make this sort of pretty star shape that reminded people of the star of Christmas. They also have this red coloration to represent the blood of Christ. But these red colors aren't actually the flower of the plant like most people think. So you can see, if you look really closely, the shape of these red parts here are exactly the same as the leaves that are growing on the plant. And that's because the red portions are modified leaves. And they help to draw attention to the flower, the actual flower, which is small and tiny and in the very middle. And this one that I picked actually only has little teeny tiny buds that are pretty hard to see growing down there in the middle. I got a picture over here of some slightly better flowers that allow you to see a little bit more of what they look like when they open up. So there'll be those yellow colored portion in the middle. That's the actual flower from a poinsettia. And this picture over here also shows you can see. And this is where the reproductive part of the plant will be. It'll make the pollen and then develop into seeds there and the flowers in the middle. And these are just bright red colors to help draw the attention of pollinators to those flowers in the middle. All right, so those are all the Christmas plants that I have for you today. I hope you guys have a great holiday season. And if you have any questions or anything I said that you want me to expound on a little bit more, you can leave a little note for us in the comments, and we will talk to you soon. Bye.